You are listening to the Vichaar Manthaan podcast.
Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Vichaar Manthaan podcast. I am your host Sumit Sharma and it gives me great privilege to be hosting this project. This is a podcast looking to explore modern day concepts, themes and commentaries through a civilizational lens, a Hindu civilizational lens, a Dharmic lens. Now for those that don't know, Vichar and Manthan, two words, mean the ideas and the churning of thoughts. It's about bringing together intellectuals, academics, scholars, special matter expertise, and prodding them and shaping them in the eye of Dharma, in the eye of sustainability. Very excited today to be introducing you to Sriram Balasubramanian, who has written a book called Kautilyanomics for Modern Times. You can see it here on screen. So this was an international bestseller. It's done very well in India. It's been cited by some of the top economics, and I'll actually just read a quick blurb for you all here before we go into the detail. So this is by Sanjeev Sanyal, who's an economist, author, and former principal economic advisor to the government in India. So Sanjeev says, 2 millennia after they were written, Kautilya's ideas continue to inspire debate on the form and nature of governance. The historical context may have changed, but many of Kautilya's arguments still ring true as policymakers face the same trade-offs to this day. Sriram Ji's excellent book brings these ideas alive and lucidly reintroduces them to a 21st century audience. For me, this is really interesting. The fact that this book is published by Bloomsbury and thousands of copies have been sold in India, it rings true for me. I resonate with the fact that there is ancient wisdom in our roots, and someone like Sriram Ji, who's joining us here today, has taken deep time, and we're going to go into detail with this, has taken deep time to put together a book about the economics that were written many years ago and how they're applicable to the times of today. So Sriram Ji lives in Maryland. He is an alumni of Columbia University, economist, author, and tells me he has keen interests in international microeconomics, Dharmic civilization, and cultural components thereof. This is his third book. He's written previous books, and so this one in particular has been cited by The Hindu, the New Indian Express, and also was the top economic book on Amazon India in the latter half of 2022. So Sriram Ji, namaste, and thank you for joining us on the Vichaar Manthaan podcast.
Namaste, Sumit. It's an honor to be here. A huge namaste to all your viewers, listeners, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion.
And thank you for joining us. So, before we dive into the actual book itself, can you help me understand what it takes for someone to do research and prep and time? What were your drivers for essentially writing a book? How does one go about doing that?
Yeah, it is quite an exercise, I would say. First of all, I want to mention that these are my personal views and reflect that of the author. And writing a book of this scale, I think, involves it's a tedious process for a variety of reasons, right? First of all, a lot of our ancient texts, especially related to Sanatana Dharma, are in dense Sanskritam and Prakrit in some cases. So the first challenge is in terms of the language of the text. And there are very few translations of most of the text, especially the Arthashastra. There are about 4 to 5 translations. And most of these translations are done by, Sanskritam scholars. There's one by Shyama Shastri in 1915, T.G. Shastri in early 19th century, and then by Kangle in 1960s, 50s, 60s, and then by Rangarajan in 1990s. And there are a few more recent ones. But my point is all of these are by Sanskritam scholars. So essentially, these are people who probably are well versed in Sanskritam, aren't subject matter experts. So the Arthashastra as a text is a very vast text that covers a wide range of areas. There's the reason why it's called the Arthashastra. And while a lot of discussion has been on issues related to political Chanakya niti, on self-help and improvement by some scholars, the mood and of course foreign policy and strategy, the mood of the book, as we call it, is on the artha part of it.
Sure.
But so the first challenge is to get the for myself to sort of I know Sanskritam, so to sort of work on the language a bit,
Sure.
and then engage with real scholars who are working on the subject. So that's the first sort of challenge
Sure.
with this type of an exercise. The second challenge is to bring in, say, contemporary finance, economic knowledge, which I sort of bring to the table.
Yeah. And that's to make it more relatable to the audience of today, right? Because, when sometimes we speak about historic books or scripts and texts that were written a long time ago, the question then becomes, how relatable is this to the modern day? How can we learn anything from this? Is it even applicable? And so I think what you're saying in this book is that they are applicable, and some of this wisdom is timeless in nature.
Absolutely. See, my personal view is that I think, again, this would be very important for your audience. I was working on, in my professional capacity, on a data set by an economic historian called Angus Madison. I think your listeners should probably Google search Angus Madison. He's a world-renowned economic historian. So he produced this report in early, I think, 2000s on he produced a report on 1,000 years of economic history. It was published by the OECD as well. And the Norwegian Research Institute, he's no more now, but the Norwegian Institute still has his information and hosts his entire research. So in that, a lot of people cite this, but very few people sort of work on the data related to this. So in his thesis or his research, he argues that India and China were the top economic countries, countries with the highest per capita GDP and GDP itself,
Sure.
with a set of macro indicators from 0C onwards till 17th century. So this was something, which is fascinating to me. And when I looked at the data, obviously there are, contrarian views saying that this could be a proxy of population, and because of higher population, you could get this number.
Sure.
But anecdotal evidence, supporting evidence, secondary sources, across a variety of Chinese embassy notes, travelers, travelogues by the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, for example. All of these Greek travelers indicate that, Bharat was a prosperous place during this time. So my view was that there had to be an economic philosophy underpinning this prosperity. What I'm trying to say is that on a question on why or how our Sanatana Dharma is or these ancient principles are relevant, I think the question is, the answer is right there in the data. And I think it is very important for us to discuss and debate this. I'm not saying that everything of the past is relevant today.
Sure. But there's certainly some wisdom to be unlocked and some knowledge to be gained about how ancient societies and civilizations governed themselves and had economic resource understanding, power, and were able to run humanity in such a way. Are we saying that those ideas have been lost over time?
I would say that, first of all, see, unlike the West, unfortunately in India, or in our Bharatiya civilization, we have such a rich history, but very little of it is studied in an objective manner. So the first exercise is to figure out what are we in the first place, right? What are some of these texts? What do they even talk about, right? For all the talk on the Arthashastra, this is probably the second book that talks about the economics of Kautilya, right? After such a long time. So there is definitely a dearth of knowledge on this subject. So my argument is first there has to be an understanding. There has to be a debate. There's a discussion on what actually Kautilya thought about from the material that is available, right? And the second point is, you also, the wisdom that you're talking about, that we distill, it is particularly relevant for professions or for themes related to economics, politics.
Sure.
Because primarily, whether 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, today, or 2,000 years later, we are human beings. Human beings make behavioral choices. In simpler terms, you go to a shop, you buy some product, you're having a thinking behind that process, and then you're buying something.
Yeah.
It is still a fundamental behavioral choice.
Sure.
The quantum, the nature, how you're buying it, you might be buying it over a laptop, rather 2,000 years ago, you might be buying in your street or whatever it is. The process is different. The way of how the individual's choices are made are different in terms of the execution, but the thinking process is still done by a human. So the same thing for a political establishment as well. So what I'm trying to say is that the fact that behavioral choices by human beings determine some of these outcomes, and how people have dealt with it, whether it is thousands of years ago, I think still there's a case for one to understand this and learn the lessons from it.
Do you think people are that responsible these days? They make informed decisions. You know how easy it is to buy things. You can just open your app, Amazon. I mean, I primarily shop on Amazon. Anything I need is available there, and it turns up on my doorstep a day later. I probably don't think in enough detail about the carbon emissions and what it takes for the cardboard and the processing power that goes behind it. Don't you think perhaps we are now one step or even a few steps removed from the overall impact of our actions, especially when it comes to economics, perhaps?
No, see, what I'm trying to say is there's whatever that you buy, even if you don't think about it, there's an instinctive choice that you're making, right? So, for example, if you are, say you're vegetarian, right? So, instinctively, culturally, you're vegetarian, right? For example, I'm born vegetarian, right? I'm not eating meat all my life, right? So, instinctively, when I'm making a choice of some menu at a restaurant, I'm choosing a vegetarian menu.
Okay.
Right? Something that I like based on what I've been sort of culturally brought up with.
Yeah.
So that is driving my behavioral choice at a restaurant, right? So I'm not bringing my I might have done a PhD in say cooking on something else, but my sort of upbringing is driving this choice.
Okay.
So that's where I think the instinctive nature of your decision that you're talking about could be a derivative of some of these some of the ways that you've been brought up. That was my
there's very little restaurants in London now that you go to and you won't find a vegan menu, an actual separate menu that's vegan. But I don't believe that that's because people are wise to the idea of their impact. It may be I don't want to say it, but it could be a fad. It's popular to be vegan sometimes. But I don't know. The world is waking up. There is a jagrati in place. People are becoming aware now of the consequences of their actions, of things like climate change and greenhouse gases, or whatever the term is these days. People are more aware of the impact they have on the world, and purchasing power probably has a big part to that. There was one episode we recorded called Sustainable Contributions. Actually, it's been mentioned a few times now. So Sustainable Contributions with Dr. Bansri Lakhani, and also with Yajur Hariya, we spoke about the most financial contributions you can make in your life are things like your pension and what have you. And are we really funding change? What's the impact that we can make? So I want to zoom out. I actually want to read another blurb that's actually been written on the back of the book. So this is by Dr. Meghnad Desai, who is the Emeritus Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, who says, Chanakya is a much-cited but little-read author. He is also frequently, but in my view, mistakenly thought to have written a treatise in economics like Adam Smith did. Sriram Balasubramanian has avoided these traps and written the book concentrating on the Arthashastra. We are all in debt to him for that generous scholarly effort. So, Sriramji, tell me, let's zoom out a little bit, because I'm aware that some of the listeners on this won't know who Kautilya is, don't know what the Shastra is, or Chanakya, or anything like that. So, could we just do some basics? Who is Kautilya? What is the Shastra? And why is something like that important? Who is the person that we're talking about? Why should we be studying his philosophy today?
Yeah, thank you. So that's very kind of Dr. Meghnad Desai to give that blurb. In fact, before I get into the Arthashastra, the interesting thing is Dr. Desai actually disagrees in the comparison with Smith. He sort of views Kautilya's work on its own independent self, and I think that is precisely the main aim of the book, to get scholars to discuss and debate Kautilya and his place in society. We might disagree, agree on some of these topics,
and that's something. That's something that actually Vichaar Manthaan, and personally I pride myself on, is we're not trying to come to a conclusion here necessarily.
Correct.
It's about bringing topics onto a stage, earnestly
Correct.
discussing them to see where they fall and are they relevant, which is why we have you here today. Say, well, what's your book about? Is it important? So yeah, let's get back into.
Sure. So basically the Arthashastra is a 3rd century BCE text, and this text was written by Kautilya, or more popularly called Chanakya. And he was an advisor, the chief advisor to the king Chandragupta Maurya, as part of the Mauryan dynasty, which was ruling large parts of contemporary India, and probably even contemporary Afghanistan, Pakistan of today.
And quite a successful, renowned dynasty and time of civilization, actually.
Exactly.
Well.
At that time of civilization, it was probably one of the world's most renowned kingdom, and it had prosperity. It had a lot of economic and social prosperity during its reign, during the kingdom's reign. The text by itself has about 150 chapters, about 180 sections, and about 6,000 slokas in the text. And these slokas cover a wide range of areas in terms of defense strategies, in terms of legal prescriptions, economic philosophies, Kautilya's views on a variety of issues, on statecraft. So all these chapters deal with a wide range of issues concerning governance. And at the underpinning of all this is the role of artha, which is, in simpler terms, very, very simple translation, is translated as wealth. So Kautilya was one of the foremost thinkers to put from the idea that wealth creation and wealth is fundamental for economic prosperity in 3rd century BCE itself. So if you look at all our ancient texts, we have the Niti Shastra, the Nyaya Shastra, and a wide range of other texts. But Kautilya's unique sort of distinction is that he brought this, into the central prism, or he sort of brought this center stage of the discussion, and he believed that economic prosperity was foundational for political success. So this entire treatise sort of provides a variety of ideas, policies, and thought processes from an advisor to the king, essentially a policymaker in those times, and which covers a wide range of areas. But the fundamental premise is that all of this comes together to ensure economic prosperity. And that economic prosperity was foundational to the happiness of the people. He primarily focused on the happiness of the people, the welfare of the people.
That's so interesting.
And not on the welfare of the kingdom. There's a distinct difference between a lot of Western texts and Kautilya. So there's one sloka which I'll just quickly mention before just to give a summary of what Kautilya says, so that your listeners can get a better perspective. So it goes like this: Praja sukhe sukham rajnyah prajanam cha hitetam nat preyam hitam rajnyah prajanam tu preyam hitam. So what it says is that The English translation, the loose English translation, is that a king's happiness lies in the happiness of his subjects, and his welfare in the welfare of his subjects. A king's welfare consists not in what pleases him, but in what pleases his subjects.
That's so interesting.
So the welfare of the people was primary to Kautilya, and he believed that economic prosperity was key to people's happiness and enhancing welfare of the people.
We're probably going to talk about this later on, but maybe we need to get someone like Rishi Sunak to take this text to the current King Charles to say, look, it's not about where you're sitting and your coronation. It's the happiness of the people below it. So I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit later on. But really interesting, we think of, at least when I talk to people, we talk about sort of India and prehistoric, that was such a long time ago, they lived like cavemen. It's like, actually, that's not the case at all. There was a rich civilizational history that was born out of Bharat, or India as we know it today, that was very diverse in its views in things like the economy and various things, astrology, education system, policy. But what you're saying here, Sriram Ji, is that Chanakya or Kautilya wrote this text with the view that prosperity of society was built upon its economic welfare and the happiness of the people derived thereof. And I think people refer to wealth and wealth creation these days, and people see let's say money is the root of all evil. That's a common phrase here in the West.
Right.
Is that a naive or an incorrect understanding of how we should use wealth in our society? Does that show that the systems currently set up for wealth are not for the greater good of people?
Now, see, what I think we really, especially in our Dharmic civilizations, is the sustainability part of it, in the sense that the holistic nature of a society, right? I think economics is one component of it, but the holistic nature of society, protecting people, resources, environment, progressing, engaging with the rest of the world, trade, for example. We talk so much about globalization. To your friends, I think there are two examples which I want to give on why the past is, something that, is useless and all that. Like, because I go through such criticism. I spent 5 years on this book.
Wow.
So I'm used to this on a day-to-day basis.
Sure.
Literally, it's like oxygen to me, because people keep giving me this. But nowadays it stopped because the book is a bestseller. But what I'm trying to say is, when I was working on this, when no one really knew what all of this was, there was an obvious question: why do you want to indulge and talk about all these things?
Sure.
When there's so many years ago. But there are many reasons for this. One of the first reason, for example, contemporary reasons, is to take the idea of globalization, right? We have various definitions of globalization. Globalization has own critiques and all that. But the thought process behind globalization is a society which sort of engages with the world, right?
Sure.
And the world engages with the society. And then due to that, there's economic activity, there's progress, there's connectivity. And then, the idea of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam is enhanced. This was done by Kautilya 3,000 years ago.
Okay.
Right? There was trade, extensive trade between the West, between Greece, for example, and Bharat. In fact, the Greece current account deficit, it is famously said that depended on the coinage and the production of minerals and resources in India, in Bharat.
Okay.
So a lot of these places were connected significantly, and trade routes, maritime routes, were very, very important for this. Obviously, there was a lag compared to what we have today. It's not instantaneous. But conceptually, there's a lot of accounts which talks about, in fact, Greek traders have written a lot about how many products and spices, for example, was traded extensively, textiles, the different types of goods were also traded extensively. In fact, despite the ongoing sort of conflict and war among all these kingdoms, small kingdoms over a period of time, there's one thing that is consistent, was global trade and global economic activity, or engaging with the world, what India was doing.
So
that's one example.
Am I just on that point then? Am I wrong in thinking that the West invented trade and economy, and only in the last several hundred years did Britain and the USA and the European unions think up the idea of globalization and global trade, and things like this have only become known to man because of topics such as Brexit and how do we redefine this stuff? Is that all just incorrect? Is the West blind to what happened thousands of years ago? Do they think they just invented everything in the last couple of hundred years?
Well, to put it mildly, yes, they are incorrect. But we can give a stronger nomenclature to that. But let me leave that aside.
Sure.
No, but I wouldn't blame. I mean, they are at blame to an extent. But the reality is, we have to study ourselves to tell them what we are.
Mm.
And
does your 5 years of research into going into a book like that, is that somewhere where your passions lie? You want to bring back some of this wisdom from you said 3rd century BC when Kautilya wrote the Arthashastra?
Yeah, and more I read into it, the more and more. In fact, the first chapter in this book, I talk about pre-Kautilyan ideas. In fact, Kautilya himself argues that a lot of his ideas were sort of inspired from the Ramayana, Mahabharata,
very interesting. Okay.
Rig Veda, Yajur and all these scriptures. What you need to understand is that a lot of the focus has been on the spiritual element of these scriptures, rightfully so, because we always, Sanatanis want to focus on higher goals, but you should also be aware that there was an undercurrent of materialistic activity as well. During the Mahabharata war, you had to, for example, there was an undercurrent of commercial activity as well, which enabled some of these things.
So there's a big disconnect. So you've just mentioned spirituality, and we're talking about economics, consumerism, capitalism. There's a massive disconnect between those two, I feel, at least here in the West. You buy more, eat more, consume more, spend more. It's all about sale. The high streets are now being emptied because everyone's shopping online. Where on earth does spirituality come into that?
No, that's a fair point. But what I'm trying to say is I'm not connecting both of them. What I'm trying to say is that much of the discussion or the literature and all this is related to the spiritual part of it, rightfully so, which could be contrarian to how we live our lives today. Fair enough.
Sure.
But I think sort of text and historical facts also has an underpinning of commercial Laukika activity.
Okay.
But also what Kautilya is trying to say is that he draws some principles from some of these activities and puts these activities in a sort of a holistic footing, in a way where you still have an economic system that caters to the aspirations of common people, but ensures that there's a sustainable component of it, which sort of doesn't ruin the wider goal, or the wider cultural fabric, or even the idea of climate change, protecting the environment.
Fine.
Enhancing sustainability. So his argument is that this prosperity that he's talking about is sort of a holistic prosperity, and that is integral to what we have today. But just one more point.
Sure.
I spoke about globalization as one idea. Another is a lot of these principles. I think economic ideas. I can give you some concepts, which in fact Balbir Sihag is a professor. He's a PhD from MIT. He's an emeritus professor. He's written a brilliant book on an academic book on all this. I sort of mention in passing in my book about this, but there are these economic concepts which Kautilya himself has thought about in the Arthashastra. I'll give you an example.
Sure.
Opportunity cost. The author is by Vichaar in 1889. Kautilya has mentioned about this. Law of diminishing returns, Turgot, I think, in 1766. Kautilya has mentioned about this. Moral hazard by Smith in 76. Linear income tax, Merlis in 71. Public goods by Samuelson in 1954. The idea of optimization, importance of theory of gains from trade by Ricardo in 1817. Efficiency wages by Solo in 1867. Contingency planning in 1996. Asymmetric information Akerlof in 1970. So, and I think I mentioned efficiency wages as well, capital formation. all of these concepts, I mean, some of these concepts I mentioned, they're all basic economic concepts which we do in Economics 101.
Which we think here in the West came out in the last 100 years, 200, 300 years.
Yes, but if you look at the Arthashastra, there is considerable evidence to suggest, Balbij's book is an example, which gives theoretical sort of constructs on how Kautilya had envisaged some of these ideas before itself. The only challenge thus far was that, in a conventional textbook, you see a theory and then you see an output, right? So, but in Kautilya's case, the way the text is articulated, the output is already given, right? So you had people to actually derive their theory from the output, which is what I've attempted to make here. But my point is, these might not be articulated in the way we define as articulation today. But the underlying principle and the thought process reflects a lot of these ideas.
So you're almost saying what I've understood is that the base fundamentals, the groundwork, the initial layering of some of these concepts are born, that the genesis of those, you say, are coming from the Arthashastra, and later on in life people have been able to derive their own conclusions and summaries, and the likes of Turgot, Adam Smith, etc.
I'll give you one small example, right? Let's take the idea of minimum wage, right? We talk about minimum wage a lot in the West, especially in the US. We talk about $15 an hour as a standard.
It's something like £10 roughly an hour now. And when I first started working, it was like £3-4, but double triple all the time.
Right. So in the Arthashastra, for example, you wouldn't see the explicit term of a minimum wage.
Right.
Explicit articulation of, okay, this is minimum wage.
Right.
This is what it's defined or whatever it is. Right. But Kautilya as an idea argues that people at the lower end of the spectrum need to have a certain cap on their, below which their income can't go.
Okay.
So he argues that they need to be given a particular slabs of income. By that argument, he's saying that there is a minimum wage that we're talking about. And then he says that this minimum wage needs to be flexible because the other economic conditions keep changing. Right. Sort of a real minimum wage.
I think that's the other thing that
mentioned as a formulation, as an output, and scholars sort of derive it from it. So that is a distinction. You wouldn't see these things as but it is very easily derivable for us to understand what Kautilya said. Yeah.
And that's the other thing. I think I'm not an economist by any measure, but the understanding that the economy is not something that's stationary necessarily. There are constantly moving factors and variables. So something like how you mentioned the concept of a minimum wage or a threshold upon which the lower end of the spectrum need to be earning for what? For society to keep flourishing and upholding itself and taking everyone along on that journey with you. So I remember doing a research, you were talking, this is page 45, you've got a list of these topics where the Arthashastra is probably the economic genesis of a lot of these ideas. I think you were touching on another topic there about relevance to modern day society, which we'll go on to in a little bit of detail. But before we do that, Sriram Ji, I just want to go into something called the rapid fire round, where our audience get to learn a little bit more about you in more detail and hopefully understand why someone would dedicate such amount of time to produce a book, and the fact that it's done so well and gone on to be an international bestseller. And I just noticed here, even the foreword is by Bibek Debroy, who is the economic advisor to the Indian government, chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. So that's amazing. So I do encourage everyone to look at that. We will send a link in the description below for you to get this book. But Sriram Ji, let's enter what we call the rapid fire round.
Yeah.
So Sriram Ji, if you were stranded on a deserted island, what 3 items would you take with you and why?
Yeah, probably Kautilya's Arthashastra for getting me out of that island, or some insight into ancient escape routes.
Great answer.
2 would be probably again one of my religious scriptures, either the Bhagavad Gita or something of that sort. And 3rd would be probably my phone, I guess.
Okay, sure.
to stay connected, or at least try to find some way to survive.
Excellent. And to do podcasts like this, of course.
Yeah. at least.
Excellent. What goes into your perfect breakfast smoothie?
I don't really have a choice. My wife is a very good chef, so she generally gives me rather. I have a lot of choices, but it's just I don't have a preference. Let me put it that way.
Sure.
So banana milkshake would be something that I have once in a while as
Awesome.
a smoothie.
That works. Thank you. What's the best piece of advice someone has ever given you?
Can I tell the best piece of advice that I've learned in life?
Sure, that works.
I think the best piece of advice is to embrace failure very early in life. I think one of the biggest, one of the consistent trends that I've seen in my life thus far is that people who can respond, react to failure, that is really the strength of the individual and the strength of successful people. Their ability to respond and move forward despite failure. So that's why I have this theory that especially people who are young, in school especially, my theory is that people who are, say, the average guy, average person in school, generally does well in life.
Interesting.
As long as they're hardworking and doing well, because I feel because they're used to failure a lot. When people are not used to failures, and suddenly life throws a variety of questions at you, you've been succeeding all through your young age, then it becomes difficult. So I think dealing with failure and embracing failure and learning the lessons from failure is most important.
That's
So I
very
would say,
remarkable. I resonate with that a lot. I do believe in failing fast, moving forward, picking up. But you've actually touched on something a little deeper there, and you talked about your ability to respond, which I understand as your responding ability, and therefore your responsibility. So life will throw.
no, the thing is,
curveballs.
you become, especially when you're young, and say you work hard, you do all the right things, but for a variety of reasons you don't succeed. I'm not saying you should fail deliberately. What I'm trying to say is that you do all the things that society tells you to do. You're honest, you work hard, you do your best, but somehow you don't succeed, and you're still the average kid. But at the end of the day, it teaches you the ability to understand that you're infallible, and there are a variety of other circumstances that determine your success. The more you come to terms with that, the more you come to terms with a bigger sort of ecosystem driving your own personal growth.
Sure.
And I think that maturity is very, very central to anyone's success, in my view.
Very nice. Thank you for that, Sriram Ji. Great wisdom. Great words of wisdom here on the Vichaar Manthaan podcast. Do you have a favorite book? You can't say your own. Do you have another favorite book?
Yeah, I would say one is obviously The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. It really did leave an impression on me when I was young, and it's something that it sort of struck a chord with me, I would say.
Nice.
So I think that is one book that really.
I enjoy that too. My wife loves that book, and I listened to it for the second time or third time, maybe last year, on Audible. So, become the wind, become all the elements in between. Very nice. Thank you. If you could have one superpower, what would that be?
Superpower. Probably make India a superpower right away.
That's going to happen anyway.
I don't know. Superpower. I would probably want to go back in time and engage with all our rishis and get all their wisdom in one swoop.
Very nice.
For the world to deal with today.
If you could sit down with Chanakya, what would you ask him?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Give me a couple of seconds. So, what would I ask him?
One question.
Yeah, I'm still thinking.
No problem. Let's come back to that. Maybe we'll do that at the end.
Yeah, probably at the end. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite quote
Yeah. There are two quotes. I mean, you're talking about in the Arthashastra or
Generally,
or
in,
general?
in your life.
Yeah, I think the quote of Vasudeva Kudumbakam is pretty.
And could
It
you
appeals to
translate
my.
that for our audience?
Yeah,
Vasudeva
sure.
Kutumbakam.
Yeah. So this is the quote. Let me read the quote itself.
See.
Ayam bandhurayam nethi ganana laguchesasam udara charitra namthu vasudeva deva kudumbakam. The distinction, this person is mine and this one is not, is made only by the narrow-minded. For those who of noble conduct, who know the supreme truth, the whole world is one family. So the idea of the world being, one family, is I think a very powerful concept.
Very nice. Thank you for sharing. If you had to fight one horse-sized chicken or 10 chicken-sized horses, which one would you pick? One horse-sized chicken or 10 chicken-sized horses?
Probably one horse-sized chicken.
Okay, good for the one adversary. Okay. Has there been a moment in your life where your paradigm shifted?
Yeah, I would say about 10 years back, 10 years, yeah. And I had gone to Rishikesh, which is basically a tip of the Himalayas in India, in Uttarakhand. And I was at the Shivananda ashram, which is Shivananda. Swami Shivananda was a great saint. And he had built this huge ashram. And I spent a week and a half there. And it completely transformed my life, my perspective, my what I view on life. And there's a natural sort of cleansing, put it that way. And I became a completely different person after that.
Wow. I speak to lots of people and I hear lots of stories, and the people that go to Rishikesh and Haridwar and these kind of areas, their life does change as a result. There was one lady we have had on the podcast before, Divya Prabha, and she was an economist and she worked in London, very big, and she took a one-way ticket to India, and it's been 20 years and she hasn't come back. And now she runs an ashram, the International Chandramuli Trust in Rishikesh. So and there's connections to Varanasi and everything there. So very nice to hear.
I spent about 1 week to 10 days with zero contact with the rest of the world.
Wow.
Literally, I mean, at least with family and all that. You have a routine, you have a discipline, you just keep walking, keep engaging with nature. It's a divine experience. It probably transformed me completely, and much of what I am today, especially with the book and all these, if you might call a success, is largely to that experience, I would say.
I think so. We've got the concepts there. So thank you for sharing. Let's do a couple more, then we'll go back into the rest. So I give my guests an opportunity on the podcast to make a commitment. So Sriram Ji, is there something in your life that you would like to commit to? Is there something that you have been meaning to do, or is there a habit you're trying to break, or a habit you're trying to create, or something you'd like to commit to our listeners here on the Vichaar Manthaan podcast? Is there something that you could offer?
Yeah, I've already committed to to extracting, deriving all these ancient wisdoms, especially on contemporary topics, and taking on some of the naysayers. So I think that is something which is already inbuilt. So that is a commitment I can give.
Excellent.
Hopefully, 10, 20 years down the line, you wouldn't need people to go and start digging around these topics. They would already be in public discourse. There would be debate and discussions and all these.
Excellent. I've got one last question, and it's a good one because it will relate into some questions that I think we should go into a little bit later on. What does the term sustainability mean to you?
Sustainability means, a holistic worldview. Sustainability is not for the now. I think often we at least in the last 20-30 years, the idea of sustainability has become a sort of a rat race to save the universe. But I think while that is an important, component of it, I think there's a holistic uh, uh, understanding that one needs to get, that the idea of lokakshema, the idea of universal sort of viewing nature as lokamata, as something that you want to, which goes far beyond the challenges of contemporary society. You want to protect it for multiple generations, for even your own spiritual experience, for example. Viewing sustainability in that prism,
Okay.
I think, makes it a far more natural phenomena rather than a transactional exercise.
Interesting.
When it's a natural phenomena, you sort of allude to it naturally.
Okay.
And that's where the dharmic way of life, I feel, is far ahead in terms of sustainability. And when it's a way of life, it's a natural sequence of events rather than some sort of imposition from someone else.
Great answer. So we'll end the rapid fire round there, but I think we'll stick on this topic and something that you just mentioned there, and the fact that it's more of a natural way of looking at things. Do you think that's why, in the way you refer to it as a rat race of sustainability, and it's a buzzword now for sure, and now we've got concepts such as greenwashing? So are we really trying to be sustainable here now, or are we just trying to tick some boxes?
Yeah, look, I think it's very simplistic to give a perspective which is just white and black, right? A lot of these elements have various layers of gray in it, right? I think the intentions of everyone is fairly noble, most of them, right? That you want to protect the world, protect the nature. In some cases, albeit it's come too late, but that's fine. But what I'm trying to say is the intentions are good, but how do you sort of implement some of these ideas in a sustainable manner itself?
Okay.
How do you ensure sustainability as a concept is sustainable in its execution, right? Is continuous in its execution. In my view, there's a limited role that the state can. I mean, there's a role that the state can play on all of this, state or private sector, whatever it is. But eventually, individuals and individual human beings need to make choices, which ensures that the world is a sustainable place. Unless you or I make a conscious choice in our actions, the idea of sustainability is going to be just an elitist slogan.
But does that come back to responsibility again? Do I feel like I am responsible for whatever, my purchasing or my actions? Do I even have the depth of understanding that my actions can have consequences? I don't think the layman or the general person thinks like that at all.
Correct. I think that's also again Kautilya's argument, right? His principle on ensuring Dharma is foundational to economic prosperity deals with that, because he feels that if the common person relates to this idea of sustainability being a swadharma, then it's a natural way of life for that individual. So he or she believes in that construct, that his or her actions has a wider impact on society.
Can we break that down into an example that, say, everyone can understand? So what comes to mind to me, and I was talking with some family the other day about Singapore, for example. In Singapore, you don't see litter on the streets. You don't see chewing gum or anything like that, because people keep it clean for the I don't know if it's the fare of the state or whatever it might be, but it's a clean country. It's a clean city to be in. Everyone feels like they're responsible for the cleanliness. So when you have rubbish, you throw it away in the bin. Are we saying that the society there is culturally aware, or they're thinking about sustainability, so they keep everything clean? Is that derived from the government or the state, or is that something built within them? And is this even a good example of what you're talking about?
Okay, so in Singapore's case, I've lived in Singapore for more than 5-6 years, so I think I have some
Sure.
some experience with this. First of all, it's a very small place, right? So you could go from one end of Singapore to another end in 2 hours, right? So it's less than the population of probably one tier 2, tier 3 city in India. So that is one context, right? The second context is, you're right, the rule of law plays an important role. I mean, Kautilya also argues that the rule of law is important. That is, the idea of Dandaniti and ensuring rule of law is implemented is an important driver in ensuring that you get clean outcomes like this that you're talking about, right? But a lot of Kautilya's ideas apply to, I think, larger societies,
Okay.
more complex societies, especially in Asian societies, India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, some of these bigger countries, where there's a huge dynamic difference. I'll give you an example, right? If you take the Swachh Bharat scheme, which the Indian government has implemented, which is basically a scheme to keep your society clean, which is pioneered by the Prime Minister of India. There was, according to anecdotal data, the scheme is far more effective in rural areas than in urban areas.
Interesting.
Right. So it's a contradiction by itself, because rural areas are supposed to be less educated, less aware of the world, or whatever that you call it. The urban area is supposed to be the sophisticated, educated lot. But if you just go across any rural place today and compare that to a conventional city in India, you always find the rural areas to be far cleaner.
That's so interesting.
One of the reasons for this pickup was that in India, despite the fact that society outside might not be clean, we are all very clean in our houses, no matter how poor or rich you are. So you have a way, because our upbringing sort of ensures that this cleanliness part of it is our dharmic responsibility, right? This responsibility was basically taken out in the sense that because of the scheme and the ability of the Prime Minister and the entire setup to awaken this consciousness, you could call it dharmic consciousness, and take that to your neighborhood, then it becomes a normal way of life, which means every day when you clean your house, you go outside your house and ensure that the surrounding area is also clean.
Sure.
And it becomes a natural recurring action. And especially if it comes to the scale of the Prime Minister and the system and all that,
Okay.
it becomes a natural consequence of action. So what I'm trying to say is this way of life, which is there in larger societies, or at least Asian societies, at least in India, put it that way, where I have primary experience, drives economic outcomes and enhances policy efficiency to be far more efficient.
And so these policies are then things like sanitation waste and
correct. So
all the other things within society that start building up. So where one individual is
correct,
feels conscious to clean their home and clean outside their home and clean their city and not,
correct,
that consciousness you're saying goes further up the chain into providing safe sanitation and making sure we've got solid liquid waste, etc., so that even the rural villages are now flourishing more, society is being uplifted to a certain extent.
Right. See, imagine how else would you drive this behavioral change? Imagine you bring in a law.
You could
right?
fine people, right?
If you could do this, whether it'll be as effective, I still doubt, because
probably not.
If it is natural to yourself. So that's where there's a distinct difference between, especially in societies such as India, there's a way of life which people are living on day to day because of their cultural past, because of generational, of cultures and the way they brought up. And then there's the policymakers' inputs, right? The policymakers' inputs often superimposes over this way of life, right? So the individual takes time to adapt to this. And in most cases, they don't change because their way of life is what they've been inbuilt for centuries. But imagine if you're smart enough to adjust to his or her way of life and then bring the policy in a way that complements this, then policy becomes far more effective.
And I think that's where I was trying to get to with the Singapore example, that I think you can be heavily fined, but has it been so ingrained into people that it's no longer about the fine, it's about actually keeping the place clean? I think
To an extent, I mean, Singapore is a highly religious society. I mean, there are hundreds of temples.
Sure.
There are 3 communities which are it's a very culturally harmonious society.
Sure.
That could be an angle. I mean, there is no empirical evidence to suggest that,
right.
In my view. But I think a combination of these two for large societies, especially Asian societies, culturally driven societies, I'm not sure of the West, but culturally driven societies. But now probably the West itself, because of demographic changes and different communities coming in, and probably the next 20, 30 years, or even the next 100 years, might fall into this bracket.
I think so. In fact, we're talking about multiculturalism tonight. We have at time of recording, there is an event happening tonight in central London where Vichaar Manthaan is talking about multiculturalism, and where actually some of the statistics suggest it doesn't actually work, and you have different societies compelling with others. But let's not get into that. Sriram Ji, I want to take you back to chapter 5. You've written about sustainable growth and welfare, and I know we've been speaking about it at some extent, and you go into some details about sort of socioeconomic benefits, things like clean water access, biodiversity. Could you elaborate on some of the ideas that Kautilya had around the theme of sustainability, and maybe in particular sustainable finance? What exactly is sustainable finance, and why is it important?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring is probably, I'm trying to get the exact page in the book, the idea of, I think, page 157. That would be a good summary of what I define of sustainable growth. See, there are 3 pillars of Kautilya's. How we view sustainability is through the idea of responsibilities.
Sure.
There is no distinction or binary between responsibilities and rule of law. In fact, Kautilya sees that as complementary. He believes in a strong rule of law, implementation of rule of law, and he also believes in the idea of swadharma, or the idea of responsibilities in simple translation. One is societal responsibilities that he talks about, things like toilets, clean water, biodiversity, civic responsibilities. For example, there are quotations in the Arthashastra which talks about why people in a community, in neighborhoods, need to take care of their own sort of neighborhoods, and there are fines which sort of take care of this. There are also inscriptions which talk about why colonies and neighbors need to ensure that it's a clean society. So that sort of societal responsibility is one bucket, right? Another bucket is environmental responsibility. So Kautilya talks about forest protection, biodiversity protection. He talks about animal welfare. He talks about water management, of reservoirs, need to protect water for people, and the need to sort of protect the flora and fauna. These are all things which Kautilya mentions about. So this is the environmental responsibilities bucket. The third is on familial responsibilities. As an individual, as a familial unit, what are some of the responsibilities that you have, which take care of your own family and your kith and kin, and the way they protect the environment and the society at large. So Kautilya also views this through the prism of responsibilities, not just the prism of rule of law. And that's where I think the idea of sustainable growth and sustainable welfare also comes into play. Even in terms of finance, there is an element of all these principles that I spoke about are all inbuilt even in financial transactions, where these things need to be taken into account while people are investing, or people are, investing is a strong word in those times. I mean, people who put in some capital to move goods, or to trade and things like that. So I think the underlying principle of Kautilya was that besides the rule of law from the state, there's also the idea of dharmic responsibilities, which drive a far more continuous sustainability process.
Very interesting. I want to read another blurb here that was on the back of your book by Dr. Niranjan Radhaksha, who's a columnist, CEO, and senior fellow of Artha India. So it goes, the ongoing churn in economics includes calls to pay more attention to styles of thinking that have come from outside the dominant Western paradigms. This insightful book by Sriram Balasubramanian on Kautilya's Arthashastra deserves to be read widely, as it lucidly explains the complex interactions between markets, states, institutions, and social norms in any economy. Balasubramanian not only describes the context in which one of the first treatises in economics was written, but also vividly reinterprets and connects economics with ethics of our times through his idea of dharmic capitalism. So, Sriramji, tell me, what is dharmic capitalism?
Right. That's a loaded word. So, the idea of dharmic capitalism espoused by Kautilya, as I mentioned, is that, we have a binary in contemporary economic parlance, macroeconomic parlance, between the state and the market, right? So, the state is what the government does, taxation. They invest in projects, invest in infrastructure, reduce taxes, increase taxes. They bring in schemes to stimulate economic activity or control inflation, control besides the central bank. But they do a variety of activities that control economic activity, right? In most cases, to trigger economic activity. And then there's the market, right? You go to the market, there's an IPO, there you try to get more capital. Businesses develop based on the capital, they grow, they provide employment to people, and then the cycle repeats, right? The entire sort of economic, policy making prism is on these two variables, altering these two variables, right? These two constants, but in conceptual sense, but how they sort of move and what are some of the changes that you want to make here, right? Kautilya's argument is that besides these two things, there is the idea of dharma, which is there. It's foundational to both of this. So what do I mean by that? Say there's corruption at the state, right? So if there is corruption at the state, Kautilya's argument is that a more dharmic society, which is a more ethical society, would deal with the corruption as an autopilot automatically.
Sure.
And a more dharmic society would reduce the amount of corruption by the state because people are far more dharmic in nature, right? So that plays a role of sort of correcting what the state and issues of the state are without the state as an entity being involved, right? The same thing in the market. We talk about the issue of moral hazard, which is essentially, in very simple terms, say extra favors given to some entities compared to others.
Sure.
Right? So a more dharmic society, again, would ensure that, there is equality and equity in the way companies present themselves. There's a certain level of honesty in discourse and discussions, right? This, again, tries to play a role of self-correcting society. So Kautilya's argument was that if the foundation of dharma is enhanced, then both the state and the market are sort of helped in an autopilot way.
They're kept in line, and people are self-governing almost.
Correct. So it makes these two binaries work in a far more efficient way using a third entity like this. Okay. A very conceptual level, right?
Sure.
So how do you define dharma? So dharma is, again, a very loaded word. There are various ways of defining dharma. But it pulls together everything. Dhara iti dharma. So in this case, I define dharma through three entities. One is ethics. If you go to page 81 of the book, that's a very important page, I would say, for your readers, listeners. So in that, I define it through ethics, harmony, and responsibilities. In the bucket of ethics, we talk about clean administration, clean institutions, enforcement of rules, and also sort of a driver of economic growth. In harmony, we talk about global outlook, which we mentioned earlier, social welfare and well-being. And responsibilities, again, sustainable growth, and the three types of responsibilities we mentioned. So the entire ethics bucket is mapped to a rule-based yet non-intrusive state. And then the harmony bucket is mapped to wealth creation via global outlook. And then responsibilities is sustainable growth and welfare.
Wow.
So the three big components of dharmic capitalism, at least through Kautilya's dharmic capitalism, is a rule-based yet non-intrusive state. This means a state which is enforcing all the rules, but doesn't micromanage the activities that you do. Wealth creation via global outlook, engaging with the world, believing in wealth creation. And then sustainable growth and welfare. Sustainable growth and welfare, taking care of the lower ends of society, taking care of environment, and still growing beyond this in a sustainable manner.
Wow.
So these are three buckets of what I define as Kautilyan dharmic capitalism, based on the simplified definition of dharma and its components. And the entire book revolves around these ideas in various themes. For example, on trade, on wealth creation. So it goes into trade during Kautilya's time. Then it talks about trade during time today. And then there's the Kautilyan Tantra, which is a theme or an idea which Kautilya had and its relevance today. And at the end, each of these chapters sort of combine together to talk about the dharmic capitalism framework and give us the examples of the same.
Very nice.
Yeah, in very simple terms, this is what I define as dharmic capitalism or Kautilya's dharmic capitalism in this book.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sriram Ji, for sharing that with us. Just want to read a summary here that I've read at the start of the book. India was an economic power to reckon with until its economic decline in the 18th century. What explains this long period of prosperity? The answer might lay in a framework of social and economic thought that lies buried in our ancient heritage, of which Kautilya's Arthashastra is a major example. So, Sriram Ji, the title of the book is Kautilyanomics for Modern Times. What we've spoken about and everything I've kind of understood is that you're providing a frame of reference for modern day economists, policymakers to understand the ancient wisdom locked away in Sanatana Dharma. Not locked away, but open to discover and interpret. So I think lots of people listening to this podcast and various pieces of your work may get an understanding of the deep wisdom and how they may apply it to their life, and maybe people with more influence and authority are able to bring economic or dharmic capitalism into their line of work. But for a policymaker, maybe, what would you say are some of the practical points of intervention or to shape policy that they could take to help us move towards a Kautilyan model?
Yeah, that's a fair question, right? I think that is precisely what I'm trying to. The question that you asked me, we did not discuss this question, but the one of the main aims of the book was to get common people to ask this question, because that's when we move forward. So the question really is, how do you sort of distill these ideas into contemporary policy outcomes? That's because for a policymaker, it's a very difficult task for a bureaucrat, because we often criticize the bureaucracy in whichever country we are in, but the policymaker has limited choices. He has limited time. He or she has limited time, and he or she has infinite expectations that need to be fulfilled. So how can this be sort of used in some of policy making? There are two ways I think we could do this. One is at the margins. An example of what I gave in Swachh Bharat, where a particular policy is, say, 80% effective on its own. If you want to make it 90% effective, you sort of curtail to the dharmic instincts of those entities, communities, and engage with those communities. Try to understand what are some of these natural tendencies that they have based on their old cultural facets and way of life, and try to tweak policy, nudge. This is what I call dharmic nudges.
Okay.
Which nudge them towards their way of life and ensuring that your policy prescription is more effective. So that it becomes a natural pilot rather than you imposing something on them. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is probably a longer way, but probably more applicable to India and communities such as that, is to have systemic indices, for example. I mean, let's take, instead of sustainability indices, let's say you have Dharma coefficient index, for example, right? A sustainability index just talks about, it has a set of parameters which they define, and each parameter has an index or a survey which gives them some input, and then they create the index. Similarly, if you can talk about various definitions of Dharma and then various connotations of Dharma, and have a proxy for each of them, and then evaluate a quantitative metric that sort of talks about how the Dharma coefficient is there in some society, some state, for example, in India, and then aggregate it to a national level. And then you see how this changes on other economic indicators. So they can establish time series in a relationship or whatever it is. So it's a longer process of establishing a research field or enhancing a research field, which aids the policymaker in terms of an index. It gives them some quantitative metric for them to, use in policy. So these are two ways I would sort of see it.
Sure.
On how we can use some of these ideas. And then obviously there's the abstract way of, using these principles in an intuitive sense for the policymaker to use to guide him or her in his decision making. That is always there.
Sure. Brilliant. Okay, Sriram Ji, I think we've spoken in depth about a lot of different concepts in your book, the way it provides a framework, how you've defined frameworks, and it goes down into the next level of detail. So the key themes maybe sort of labor combats equality, trade, and I think you're trying to join academic and the common person together to help them understand that the Arthashastra, Chanakya, and how Kautilyanomics essentially translates into modern times. So thank you for sort of summarizing that. Thank you for spending the time to put together a piece of work like this and create this book and go forward. So do you have a parting thought or some words of wisdom or a call to action for the listeners of the Vichaar Manthaan podcast when it comes to your book and this work and what they might be thinking about?
Yeah. To the listeners of the podcast, I think the first thing that I would request all of you to do is, of course, buy the book. And it's available on Kindle internationally. And then obviously the Indian version is available. And then please read and review the book. I mean, whatever your honest thoughts are, because unless we discuss and debate and engage, it's very difficult for us to take the message across. And then it would be really useful if you could share some of these things to the younger members of your family, because surprisingly, or pleasant surprise is that the biggest audience for this book are people between 18 to 25.
Okay.
These are the people who are really lapping up the book, especially in India. They really like complex content. They engage with complex content, and they're willing to sort of open up to their minds. So it'll really be helpful, to sort of spread the message to people so that people get an awareness. We come from a civilization which has profound thinkers, sophisticated thinkers, and we come from a society which has been thriving for generations. Natural economic prosperity and world dominance was the status quo, not the exception. So for thousands of years. So at least for a sense of a connect to the past, I think it's very important that people are introduced to such ideas, and people engage with such ideas. I mean, there could be a debate and discussion of what we define as Dharma and what are the contours of Dharmic capitalism. All those sort of discussions and debates need to come through. And for that, we need to have an understanding of our past. And I think this is a step towards that. So my, request to all your listeners is to read, review, and then, share the message to whomever they think are appropriate. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Sriram Ji, for that compelling call to action, the understanding. And if we think about the sort of the virtues and values of Vichaar Manthaan, is about bringing honest conversation, earnest dialogue about such topics. And I think you've put it very nicely that there is a rich tapestry of knowledge baked into our culture, into the history that comes out of Bharat, or as we know it, modern day India, and I think you're right, the youth want to know about. They need to know about and in particular here, the economics of our time. So, and for those of you that haven't read the book or seen the book, I'm still working my way through it, and I'm very honored and privileged to be speaking to the author directly here on the Vichaar Manthaan podcast. So Kautilyanomics for Modern Times seeks to do three things. First, to provide a structure and a context for Kautilya's economics thoughts. Second, to examine his work's relevance today. And third, to do it in a way that a lay reader can follow and grasp easily. Kautilya's thought is mainly articulated through the prism of dharmic capitalism and its components. Some examples include his views on global economic outlook, state market dynamics, and sustainable growth through observance and environmental, societal, and familial responsibilities. Fathoming India's rich economic and philosophical heritage and making use of it, Sriram Ji argues that it would prove to be a great asset in the country's ascent again. And I think India is becoming that new superpower. It's leading things like the G20 and is invited to COP and various things. It now has the largest population on the planet. I think there's no doubt in anyone's mind that India is the next superpower to be. I think even just the fact that the average age is so low and there is a general awakening of traditional thought, dharmic culture, and actually in a view of prosperity for not just India, but for the rest of the world. I mean, if you look at just the COVID vaccines, the fact that India donated how many vaccines to other neighboring countries where members of the first world were not able to do so. And I watch things like Dr. Jaishankar and various Amit Shah and people like that talking about how great this power is to become. So lots of great thoughts, and Sriram Ji, I think you put it very nicely in terms of the thoughts that are coming out of India and where knowledge and wisdom can be unlocked and untapped. So Sriram Ji, thank you once again for joining us here on the Vichaar Manthaan podcast.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and my best wishes to the VM podcast and the organizers. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you very much, Sriram Ji. And to everyone else listening at home, the VM podcast is a project looking to explore modern day issues through a dharmic lens. Through in-depth interviews with some of the best thinkers of our time, this podcast explores how we can better understand Dharma, better understand our lives, and recapture the ancient and classical ideals of sustainability, liberty, and flourishing. Do tune in for an earnest conversation. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Audible, and your favorite streaming platform. And just like Sriram Ji mentioned here today, it's about having an earnest conversation with debate and dialogue. So if you have agreed, disagreed, or have a comment to make about anything in this podcast or any podcast for that matter, I do want to hear from you. You can email me on podcast@vichaarmanthan.org or on all our social media channels. Thank you once again for tuning in to the Vichaar Manthaan podcast. I am your host, Sumit Sharma. Thank you and namaste.